Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Shakespeare's Macbeth. Although Titus Andronicus holds the title for the absolute bloodiest and most violent of Shakespeare's plays, Macbeth is definitely one of the creepiest. There's also the fun tradition that you're not supposed to say the title of the play when you're in a theater unless you're actually performing it, because of the curse. So don't walk into a play and say,
the Scottish play.
Rather, you should say, the Scottish play. The play centers around the psychology of a murderer and features creepy sleepwalking scenes, witches with boiling pots, ominous prophecies spoken by terrifying visions, and lots of things not being what they appear. Just a few lines into the beginning of the first scene, we hear the line, "Fair is foul, and foul is fair." Things that appear to be beautiful can be terrible underneath, and things that appear to be terrible may be something other than that. Nothing is what it seems. This is definitely true when the great and celebrated war hero Macbeth, who saves his king from treachery, quickly twists and turns into a devious, horrifying, violent tyrant who murders multiple children to secure his ambition. He's also backed by his wife, who hates the milk of human kindness, and says she'd be happy to dash out her own baby's brains as he was suckling at her breast if it served her ambition. They're a pretty creepy pair. And what about those witches who keep feeding Macbeth prophecies that lead him in pursuit of ambition and power, give him an overweening confidence, and ultimately lead him to his destruction? What is their role in this story? Are they good or bad or merely indifferent? Their involvement certainly triggers a whole lot of really horrible things in Macbeth's life. And definitely the way they disclose information to Macbeth creates problems. But in reality, they only speak the truth to him. Are they planting and growing an evil seed within Macbeth? Or was the evil always there? And their words and prophecies merely give him the opportunity to push aside his inhibitions. In any case, this play is particularly dark, although we do have the heroism of Macduff and the goodness of Malcolm at the end to give us a little bit of hope for the future. Not to mention the prophecy that Banquo's children will become kings. I want to point out 3 things I really love about this play and then give you the overall plot summary. Sometime in the future, I'm going to come back to it and do a close analysis act by act. So the first great thing about this play is just the general tone of the play. The delightfully creepy witches who continually add to the story. The witches set the tone from the very first scene, and that dark, creepy, magical feel continues even when the witches aren't around. There's a sense of overall foreboding through this whole thing. Characters are whispering in alleys, afraid of being overheard and turned into the tyrant who will kill them. We have characters exchanging social niceties while under the surface there's that sense of fear and ominousness that someone's out to get ya. Not only is the overall tone creepy and ominous, but there's also an exploration of mental illness within this play, which is somewhat nuanced for Shakespeare's day. We have the guilt that continues to pervade through Lady Macbeth, to the point that she's having these horrible sleepwalking episodes, and confessing all of these crimes in her sleep, trying to wash invisible blood off her hands. And although she's never specifically called insane, we do have doctors who are trying to treat her and drawing the line between physical ailment and mental ailment. Macbeth in his frustration indicates that mental sickness should be able to be treated just as much as physical sickness. And it's not just Lady Macbeth who transforms. Macbeth himself is dealing with a cauterizing of his soul as he continues to commit more and more awful acts. And he continues to feel their guilt and the weight of them, but he's also trying to cut himself off from those feelings of guilt. And that horrible mix of his guilt and horror with his ambition and his delusions of immortality create a really nasty psychological problem. And all of this way before modern psychology. The third thing I love about this play is the pervading idea that nothing is as it seems. Macbeth is given what seems to be a wonderful gift, the throne, the kingdom. And yet it turns into a horrible burden and curse for him. Macbeth, the great war hero who saves the king from the treachery of Cawdor, then commits treachery himself and then runs the kingdom into the ground. The prophecies that the witches give to Macbeth, which make it sound like he'll never be able to be killed. He doesn't have to worry until Burnham Wood get up and walk all the way up to Dunsinane. Nor does he have to fear anything from any man born of woman. Well, no problem then. And yet, although those sound like impossibilities, they come to pass. What seems to be a forest walking to Dunsinane turns into an enemy army. And for Macbeth, every action he does to cover himself and set himself more securely on his throne shows his subjects and his thanes that he's an awful, horrible tyrant and guilty of all of these crimes, and therefore undeserving of the throne, ultimately leading to his downfall. It's a really fascinating and creepy story. So let's look at the action. Scene 1 just sets the stage with 3 witches speaking to each other and talking about how they're going to go meet Macbeth. In Scene 2, King Duncan hears from a wounded captain how the battle has gone, and he hears about the heroic deeds of Macbeth and Banquo, how courageous and noble they were in battle. We also hear from Ross that the Thane of Cawdor is a traitor, and he's been captured and is going to be executed. And so King Duncan decides to give Macbeth the title Thane of Cawdor, in recognition of his noble deeds. In Scene 3, we have the witches sitting there waiting for Macbeth, and Macbeth arrives and sees them and is confused by them. And they greet him saying, "Hail, Thane of Glamis! Hail, Thane of Cawdor! All hail Macbeth that shall be king hereafter." Macbeth is dumbfounded, but Banquo steps up and says, "Hey, what about me? Don't you have anything to say to me?" And they say, "Lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail Macbeth and Banquo." And Macbeth is confused because he knows he's Thane of Glamis, but he's not Thane of Cawdor, and he'll never be king, right? But the witches vanish without answering any of his questions. Banquo and Macbeth are going to laugh it off when all of a sudden up comes Ross and greets Macbeth, calling him Thane of Cawdor, fulfilling the very first of the prophecies. He hears how Cawdor was a traitor and how the title has been given over to him. And so suddenly he's thinking, oh, if this is true, then I will be king someday. This is a shock to both Banquo and Macbeth, and they decide to talk about it more later. In Scene 4, King Duncan hears of the execution of Cawdor, and it seems like he went out in a noble fashion, in spite of being a traitor. That Macbeth, who is supposed to be the loyal subject, becomes a greater and more heinous traitor than the man whose title he took. In come Banquo and Macbeth, and the king greets them warmly, and he's going to go stay with Macbeth tonight. He also names his son Malcolm as his heir, which is something of a blow to Macbeth, who thought, after receiving the title of Cawdor, that he was going to become the next king. And we see already that Macbeth is having devious thoughts. Scene 5, we cut to Lady Macbeth, who has received a letter from her husband saying everything that happened with the witches, and she's very excited. "Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valor of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal." She knows that Macbeth is going to have scruples that keep him from killing the king. He's probably just going to want to sit back and sort of hope that fate works itself out. But she says, no, we got to do something about it. You got to cut off those soft feelings. Then she hears that Duncan is going to stay in their house that night, and she goes, perfect opportunity. When Macbeth comes in, she begins to lay it on really thick. At first, Macbeth tries to brush her off, but she seems pretty insistent. Scene 4, we see the king, who's so happy to be staying in the home of his friends, the Macbeths. And Lady Macbeth is treating him as such a sweet hostess. But he wonders where the host Macbeth is. Macbeth is wandering around having fits of conscience. He sees that not only is it wrong to kill his king, but even worse that he's going to kill him when he's staying in his own home. Lady Macbeth comes in and berates him really hard for just not being tough enough. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Has it slept since? And wakes it now to look so green and pale as what it did so freely? Screw your courage to the sticking place, man! And so Macbeth is rallied by Lady Macbeth, and they decide to go in and be host and hostess. Macbeth runs into Banquo and his son Fleance, and Banquo says, hey, how about those witches? And Macbeth doesn't really want to talk about them, but he does say, what do you think about, if I were to be king? And Banquo says, well, that'd be fine and all, as long as you didn't do anything underhanded to get it. And Macbeth goes, all right. Once Macbeth is by himself, he begins to see an imaginary dagger floating in front of him. He starts getting a lot of these weird visions. Are they from the witches? Are they just his mind playing tricks on him? It's going to become a problem later on. And he feels the pull of the witchcraft, and he feels the pull of the ambition, and he follows the dagger off to kill Duncan. In Scene 2, Macbeth comes back from doing the deed, and he runs into Lady Macbeth, and both of them sort of go over everything again. They're anxious and guilty and starting at everything. Macbeth has taken the daggers out with him. He should have left them with the guards. so that they'd be blamed for the act. And so Lady Macbeth takes them from him and runs back to the chamber. Macbeth is beginning to feel the first weight of guilt and conscience, and how it's going to eat away at his soul. Methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep, the innocent sleep. Sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast. Still it cried, sleep no more, to all the house. Glamis has murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more. Sleep and death are important images all throughout this play. They hear a knock at the door and they both rush to wash up. The knocking continues as the porter very slowly goes towards the door. And as he goes, he describes himself as the porter of Hellgate, letting each person in for their sins down to their doom. Until he finally arrives at the actual gate and lets in Macduff and Lennox, two more lords. They've arrived to greet the king and take him off this morning. Macbeth greets them and Macduff goes in to see how the king is doing. He's dead. Macduff raises the alarm, and everyone rushes in to see what's going on. Macbeth then kills the two guards who are standing covered in blood, and he says he did it out of impulse and love for the king. The two sons of the king, Malcolm and Donalbain, decide it's time for them to exit. Whoever killed their father is probably going to want them dead too. And so they run off, one to England, one to Ireland. Of course, that does make them look suspicious, allowing Macbeth to step up and take the throne in the next scene. Times are dark and ominous, with a lot of creepy things going on in the backgrounds. We also see that Macduff is really unhappy with Macbeth, and there's a growing tension between the two of them. Act 3. Macbeth is now king, but it's not as much fun as he thought it would be. First of all, there was that prophecy that Banquo's children would all be kings. And if he's king and his children are not going to be kings, that seems like a raw deal. Banquo is beginning to suspect something as well, and he feels the tension with Macbeth, and so he decides to take his son and leave for a while. In spite of Macbeth's insistence that he be back in time for dinner, Macbeth then hires a couple of murderers to kill Banquo and his son. Both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth feel lots of uncertainty and guilt and frustration with the fact that they aren't incredibly secure in their position. They're also worried about Banquo. Macbeth reveals that he's doing more devious deeds to his wife, but he doesn't tell her specifically what. Meanwhile, the murderers try to surprise Banquo, and they manage to catch and kill him, but Fleance, his son, escapes and runs away. Back at the palace, Macbeth is throwing a big banquet and saying, "Man, I wish Banquo could be here." Just at that moment, Banquo's ghost shows up and sits down in Macbeth's seat. Macbeth absolutely flips out, not realizing that no one else can see the ghost but him. Lady Macbeth tries to smooth things over with her guests and tries to calm Macbeth down, but it doesn't work very well, because after the ghost vanishes, as soon as he gets himself under control again, the ghost pops right back up again. And so they wind up just dismissing all of the guests. Lady Macbeth tries to calm Macbeth down. Is this just the weight of his guilt getting to him? And Macbeth also confesses that he's concerned about Macduff, who seems to be really cold towards him. And so Lady Macbeth suggests that he summon Macduff and see what happens. He also decides that he's going to go back and try to find those witches again and hear more from them. Act 3, Scene 5 probably isn't Shakespeare's. It's a really bad scene in which the witches talk to Hecate, the queen of the witches. And it kind of messes up the whole ambiguity thing that the witches have going on. It was probably added by the playwright Thomas Middleton, who also may have done some other abbreviations and editing to the play Macbeth. He had his own play about a witch that was pretty unsuccessful, and so he took a couple of songs from his play and patched them in to Shakespeare's Macbeth. Moving on. In Scene 6, Lennox is talking with the other lords about Macbeth, and he's being really sarcastic. Pretty much everybody by now has figured that Macbeth is the guy who killed Duncan. And they all talk about the rising tension here. And they talk about how Macduff has rebuffed Macbeth's summons. And they think probably Macduff needs to head off over to England to talk to Malcolm and do something about this awful Macbeth guy. Act 4. In Act 4, we return to the witches. They're sitting around a cauldron doing the famous double, double, toil and trouble chant. In comes Macbeth to ask them some questions. And they agree and say that they'll summon up visions to speak to him. The first is a vision of an armed head. And it says, "Beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife." And Macbeth is like, "Yeah, I already know, I hate Macduff." The armed head, of course, represents the way Macduff is going to bring an army down on Macbeth. A second vision arises, and it's a baby covered in blood. Remember this when Macbeth finally has to face Macduff. The apparition says, "Be bloody bold and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." He's immune to any man born of woman. Woohoo! The third apparition appears, and it's a child crowned with a tree in his hand. See if you can figure that one out later, too. Be lion-mettled proud, and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be, until great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. So Macbeth is safe until the Wood walk all the way up to the castle. And Macbeth says, that will never be. Who can impress the forest? Bid the tree unfix his earthbound root. Sweet bodements, good. And then they show him 8 kings, the children of Banquo, who are going to rule. And not only that, the last one has a mirror, and in the mirror there's vision of king after king after king after king. Banquo's line's gonna just keep going on and ruling and ruling and ruling, much to your great despair. Macbeth is angry, but the witches vanish. Macbeth then hears from Lennox that Macduff has fled to England, and his first instinct, which was to kill Macduff, is thwarted. So from now on, he's going to trust his instincts and do the first bad thing he thinks of, which right now is to kill all of Macduff's family. Scene 2 cuts to Macduff's family, who are wondering what in the world's going on. Macduff just ran off to England and left us here. When a messenger comes in and says, you all need to get out of here fast, Macbeth wants you dead. And Lady Macduff's like, I don't know what to do. And then a murderer comes in and kills them all. Scene 3, Macduff is speaking with Malcolm in England. And we continue that theme of things not being what they seem. When Macduff tells all the awful things that Macbeth has done to Scotland, Malcolm says, oh, but I would be a worse king. I have even worse character traits. And then he goes on to list all the horrible things that he is. And he says, are you sure you still want me? And Macduff says, well, no, if you're that bad, no. I'm just gonna despair for my poor country. Fare you well, these evils thou repeatst upon thyself have banished me from Scotland. Oh, my breast, thy hope ends here. But Malcolm replies, Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honor. Devilish Macbeth, by many of these trains, hath sought to win me into his power, and modest wisdom plucks me from over-credulous haste. So Malcolm was just testing Macduff because Macbeth is all kinds of tricksy and has tried to catch him in the past. Turns out Malcolm's a really good guy, and in fact he's already ready to march on Scotland. Macduff is at first speechless and finally says, such welcome and unwelcome things at once 'tis hard to reconcile. Things being more than they seem, being double. In comes Ross with the bad news that Macduff's whole family has been slaughtered by Macbeth. There's a deep grief scene for Macduff, and then he is ready to go back and avenge his family with Malcolm. Act 5. In scene 1, we have a gentleman speaking with a doctor about Lady Macbeth. They're trying to get to the root of her problem. The biggest symptom is sleepwalking. She's walking around in the night, confessing to horrible, horrible crimes, and imagining she's washing her hands. She keeps seeing blood on them and scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing them. The doctor hears what she's saying and goes, that's too much. I didn't want to know that. He also realizes it's a malady of the mind and there's not a lot he can do for her. Meanwhile, several of the Scottish lords have abandoned Macbeth because he's awful, and they are joining up forces with the English in Burnham Wood. Macbeth knows they're coming, but he also knows that the prophecies make him pretty invulnerable, and so he's not terribly worried, although he is really miffed that basically everyone has abandoned him. He speaks with the doctor, who says that he can do nothing for Lady Macbeth. Canst thou not minister to a mind disease, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart? The doctor says, therein the patient must minister to himself. Macbeth says, throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it. Guilt is a deeper sickness than anything physical. Meanwhile, back in the woods, Malcolm suggests that they all cut branches from the trees and carry them in front of themselves as they're marching on Dunsinane. That will hide their numbers. But from Dunsinane, it also looks like Burnham Wood is walking up to the walls. Macbeth is still railing in his castle when he hears that his wife has died. She committed suicide. He's already bearing the weight of so many different emotions and problems that he can't even properly grieve for her, but responds somewhat dully. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And at that point, a messenger runs up and says, I just saw the Woods walking up to the castle, which definitely disturbs Macbeth. And now that they have masked their approach with the branches from the trees, Malcolm orders they throw down their branches and begin their attack. Macbeth runs out to fight, and though he knows that the first prophecy has already come true, at least he knows he can't be hurt by anyone born of a woman. He kills young Seward, the son of the English lord, proving his invulnerability. Macduff, meanwhile, is rushing around on the field looking for Macbeth, desperate to get revenge for his family. And in fact, the English are winning pretty easily, considering that most of Macbeth's army doesn't want to fight them, and most of the people on Macbeth's side quickly defect to the other side. Finally, Macbeth and Macduff run into each other on the field. And although Macbeth has tried to avoid him, he still feels confident that he can't be hurt by a man born of woman. I bear a charmed life, which must not yield to one of woman born. But Macduff has a great revelation. Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. He's a C-section baby! Ah, loopholes! By the way, in modern medicine, I really feel like we should just get rid of the term C-section and start using from thy mother's womb untimely ripped. It's way cooler. Macbeth realizes that the last of his hopes is gone. All of the prophecies have really just backed him into this corner. But if he gives up now, they'll just parade him around and put him on display. So he goes ahead and fights Macduff, and Macduff kills him and cuts off his head. And so Malcolm is raised to the throne, and the evil Macbeth is dead. What a play! When I get the opportunity, I'll do a more in-depth analysis of each of the acts. When I do, I'll put the links up here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.